So, as I said, I want to talk to you about static web apps today, but it's not going to be so much a .NET talk as a how to actually use it. And basically, what happened I think it was actually way back in 2020, in the middle of lockdown, I was doing Azure Live, and it was based in the Netherlands, online for the world. But one of the sponsors set it up in their office as a kind of low contact event. So you had all of the speakers there, but no audience. It was just a massive broadcast event that they organized. Really well done. About an hour before I was due to go on, I was eating pizza with fellow speakers. And someone said to me, "Oh, so what are you talking about then?" "Oh, I'm going to be talking about authentication in Azure Static Web Apps." Oh, that's cool. But they're just toys, really, aren't they? It's not like you can really do much with a static web app in real life. I was like, okay, number one, please, an hour before a speaker's going on and giving a talk, don't diss their chosen technology. At least wait until the talk's finished. But it also kind of triggered me because when people give me a challenge like that, I just kind of go, okay, right, I have to prove you wrong now. We can use this technology. And so the base for this talk was born. It's like, okay, how can we use this in a professional, enterprisey type environment? And one of the things that this speaker was complaining about, and he had a good point when he said it, was everybody just creates static web apps in the portal. They go there, they click the buttons, GitHub does a deploy, it all happens automatically, and you don't really want that in your business critical pipelines. You want to have a little bit more control about this. And it's like, okay, how can we do this? Right? We have the Azure CLI, and that has a static web app command that we can use to access things. And you have the static web app CLI. And by using these things together, we can ignore all of that out of the box stuff that you get, and we can take total control of what we're doing. So that's what I want to do today. I want to take you through the process of getting rid of that quick and easy hobby pipeline and getting something set up that you can use in a more enterprise professional environment. So, good evening or good afternoon for Kevin. I'm Stacy Cashmore. I have been developing software since I worked it out the other day at a different talk. 1994, my first commercially used software went live. That was from my A-level project, but the company I did it for liked it that much. They used it for the next few years inside of their bakery. So that was like awesome. It was even better when I got paid for it a couple of years later, but I've been making software since then. I currently work as Tech Explorer DevOps at a company called Omniplan, based here in the Netherlands in Amsterdam. Apparently, there's two Omniplans in the world, and one of them makes big project software, and I don't work for that one. I work for a tiny company that makes financial advice software for use within the Dutch market. I have been giving talks to the community since 2019, I think my first one was. And since 2020, I have been awarded a Microsoft MVP for developer technologies, something which I couldn't believe when I was first awarded it. And I still don't believe that I get to call myself an MVP now. That's just absolutely awesome. And yes, since they've been released, since preview, static web apps have really held something for me. It's a piece of technology that I really enjoy playing with, and something that I think you can make some of the more complex parts of our lives just that little bit simpler. So that's it. That is almost the entirety of my slides for today. Everything else is going to take place inside of a GitHub code space. So if I can open the right browser window, there we go. What I have here, let me just move zoom out of the way so that I can see my second screen. There you go. There's a problem. We're talking about screens. Having 2 screens is awesome. Having 4 starts to get confusing because you don't know where you put things. So I have here a very simple .NET to-do application. So the idea is that we have an API here that has one function, and that gets a list of to-dos, and it saves a list of to-dos.
Sorry, is anyone else just seeing Kermit
we
the
just
Frog?
got Kermit.
You've still got Kermit. Oh, what's the chances that Zoom decided to share PowerPoint and not share my screen?
Had that happen before.
Okay. So let's stop that share. Shall we try that one again? I want to share. I want to share a screen. And I want to share screen 4. So now you're seeing Kermit again, but if I press the magic button, do you now see code?
Yep.
Yes! We have mastered technology, she says before starting the demos. That's dangerous. So in here I have, just a really simple function. Is the zoom level okay, by the way? Do I need to zoom in or is that readable? Okay. I have 3 functions that just gets a list of to-dos, posts a new to-do, and puts an updated to-do into a Cosmos DB database. And then on the front end, I have a client application that has one single page, and that just gets a list of to-dos from the back end and allows you to edit them, delete them. No, you can't delete them yet. All you can do is just say that they're finished. But yeah, you can do stuff with your to-do list. Kind of ubiquitous thing that people are doing. They're both written in .NET. Front end is Blazor WebAssembly. Back end is .NET Azure Functions. It is .NET 8 because I've not got around to updating it yet. That's probably going to happen this winter. But everything I'm going to do here, it doesn't really have anything to do with the .NET side anyway, so it should be fine. As you can see, we don't have any GitHub workflows right now. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to make a change to the GitHub workflows, or we're going to add GitHub workflows. And they're going to do 3 things. They are going to create our static web app application. They're going to set a custom domain on that static web app. And then we're going to deploy, create staging environments to help our pull requests and clean up old environments in a 3rd workflow. So we should be getting 3 workflows done. Depending on how long it takes me to do that and get it working, we're then going to take a look at getting custom authentication working. I'll explain why that's important when we get to it. And again, if there's time, I really want to show off the data API builder that's integrated into static web apps. I don't have a workflow for that, but I think it's cool to show you because it's just another way of simply getting data from the back end to the front end without having to do a lot of work where you can put your own bugs in. So the first thing that we need to do is take a look at default pipeline. Do I have? That's the one thing I forgot to prepare. Where? Oh, let's have a look. I want here. Oh, don't tell me that I've just deleted it. I had a repo that should have been really useful for this. No, not that one. Where's my repos? There we go. I was trying to test static web apps with .NET 9 last week, but that gives me a default workflow that I can walk you through. 2 seconds, one of my monitors is deciding to be eco-friendly and turn off in the middle of a presentation. So here we have, this is what you get out of the box for the people that haven't used static web apps yet. When you go and create it inside of the portal, you link it to your GitHub repository, and it will create this workflow file for you. This will give you a CI/CD workflow that will build, deploy your application, no matter what language it's building, which is quite cool. Organize your pull requests for you so that you get staging environments when you make changes so that you can test your changes in a production environment, and basically just be all around fairly cool for something out of the box. And this is where the hobby side comes in, because for somebody just getting into this, this is just absolute magic that does just work. And what we have is on a push to our main branch or on a pull request against our main branch, we trigger this workflow. If we're pushing, or if we have a pull request which isn't being closed, then we have our build and deploy job, and it only has 2 actions in it. We check out the code, and then we run this magic Azure Static Web Apps deploy v1, passing in a token, which again, the portal creates for you when you create your static web app from the portal. So you don't have to set this up yourself. GitHub token, which is just part of your workflow anyway, and that allows it to access your pull request to put comments and things on there. And then we give it an action, upload. Now, there's extra options on here that you can get, but for just the raw vanilla one, you get these 3 options at the bottom. App location, which I've just got client. API location, which I've just got as API. And then the output location, so where is your application going to build? Nothing in here says that this is C# and Blazor. If you were to change this, say you decide, okay, I don't want to use Blazor anymore, I don't want to use Azure .NET Functions, I want a Vue front-end application, and I'm going to use Python Azure Functions. The only thing you have to change here is where your app location is, where your API location is, and where the output from your app build is. And this runs, I can't pronounce it, I can never pronounce it properly, an Onyx container that analyzes your code, figures out what it needs to use, and does all of that for you. It really is a fantastic little action. If you're in a pull request, it knows you're in a pull request, and then rather than deploying to production, it creates you an environment, gets a URL for that environment, and then updates your pull request with a link to the environment that's set up. So it knows to go to production or go to the staging environment. And last but not least, when you close a pull request, we still call that same magic action, only now we call it with the action of close. And what that one will do is check to see whether there is an environment associated with this pull request. And if there is, it will delete it and clean it, which you need to do for 2 reasons. 1, because you should clean up your environments and not have them hanging around. And 2, because there is a limitation on staging environments. On the free version, it's 2. And on the paid version, it's 5, I believe. So you want to make sure that they are cleaned up afterwards so that you don't run out of space to deploy your applications. So that's what you get out of the box. And this is what we are going to try and recreate, only having total control over it instead of just putting it into a magic action that does everything for us. So let's go back to our application. And the first one that we're going to build is our infrastructure as code, because I don't want to go to the portal to create this. I want to create this myself automatically. So we're going to make a new, allow me to right click. We're going to add a new file in GitHub Workflows /IAC. For those that don't use GitHub and aren't aware of this, anything which is .github/workflows and is a YAML file automatically appears inside of your repo as a workflow that you can trigger. Now, you may notice I haven't put IAC on here, a YAML on the end of here. And that's because VS Code, really annoying. It tries to figure out where it thinks you're going to be typing code next, which is great if you are typing code, but I know that I can't live type, so I've got snippets that I'm going to bring across, and then it actually makes the snippets just even harder to work with. So lay your bets now. How many times am I going to forget to rename this to YAML before I check it in and push it up to GitHub? So, number one, we're going to give it a name, a useful name. Create and set up SWA infrastructure. And we're going to do this on a workflow dispatch. So I do not want this to run every time I make a change. I only want this to run when I really want to update my static web app resource itself. So when you're creating it, if you're changing any environment settings or changing the hosting from free to standard, anything like that, that's when you're going to be running this workflow. Most of the time, it's going to be ignored. Then we need some environment variables that we can work with. And I'm just going to use 3 in here. So we're going to have a resource group, the name of our resource, and the region that we want to run in. And then we can start our jobs. So I want to run on latest Ubuntu. 99.9% of the time, this is correct. And just occasionally, they'll do a breaking change rollout, and not all of the workflow servers get the same change at the same time, and then you have to manually set it. After swearing a lot because you can't figure out why it's working one time and not the next. We're going to check out all of our code. And then I'm going to log into Azure. And don't do it like this, please. This is fine for demos, but there are more secure ways of logging into Azure using proper workflows. This is demo code. I'm sorry. Then once we're logged into Azure, we're actually just going to run 3 commands using the Azure CLI. First one, we're going to make sure that we have a resource group. Nothing scary there. Second one, we are going to run a bicep file, which we've not made yet. We'll get to that in a second. And that's actually going to create the resource for us. And there we're going to pass in a couple of parameters, the name of the resource that we're making, and also the SKU that we're using. And last but not least, we are going to use our first bit of actual static web app specific functionality. And we're going to use the AZ Static Web App command, access our app settings, and we're going to set some environment variables inside of our app. We need to pass in the name and the resource group. That's how you get the unique identifier of a static web app. Interesting one there. The name of the static web app, for those that don't know, doesn't have to be unique like an app service has to be unique. It only has to be unique within your own resource group because it makes up its own URL for the outside world that hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get to see in just a few minutes. And the settings that I want to put in here are a Cosmos endpoint and a Cosmos key that I'm using in my API. And then the container name and the database name within that Cosmos account that I'm using to store my data. Important thing about this command, it's slow. So it's better to make your YAMLs more unreadable than to split this up, because it doesn't matter how many settings you set, it takes about the same amount of time, and it just takes way too long. So do it in one single call. Last but not least, we need our bicep file. We've not started on that one yet. So we're going to add another new file here, main.bicep. And I am going to show you the simplest possible bicep file in order to create a static web app. We are passing in a location, which we will default to the location of the resource group we're in, but you can override it. And that location is for your Azure functions. The front end, globally available. That doesn't have any particular location except for your staging environments. They are located in the same place as your API, but the Azure functions, they run in one place. I believe that there is a public preview of a new SKU. And there, I think you can get global functions as well. But I've not played with that one yet. And honestly, unless you're running a massive global application, I don't think you're going to need it. Then we're going to use Microsoft Web static sites in order to create our static web app itself. And like I say, the minimum that you need is a name, a location, and then the SKU, which for some reason you have to name twice. New York, New York, so good, they named it twice. You can set all of your other properties that you have inside of your static web app when you're doing this, but you don't have to. If you leave it like this, we're just going to get the defaults, and that's what we're going to be working with today. So I believe that's it. If I now push this on up, I nearly forgot. We'll rename it to YAML so that it actually works, shall we? We can now commit and sync this. And if we go back to here and refresh, we have our GitHub workflows. And do we have an action? We have an action. Cool. So now we're going to run this workflow. And like I say, that's going to create the resource group, create the static web app, and make it available to use. That's going to take, depending on how happy Azure is, somewhere between a minute and 5 minutes. I'm hoping not the 5 minutes because my next file doesn't take that long to write, but we'll see. While that's deploying, though, we are going to take the next step and look at a custom domain and add that to our application. So for that, I want to create a new file. And that's going to be custom domain. If you are using static web apps, I would always add a custom domain because the names that they come up with are definitely unique and definitely not something that you want to repeat to somebody. So if I drop into the portal here, just to show you what we're up against. Come on, you can do it. Come on, little computer. If I do, hey, I can do this. I've got an audience that's going to understand what I say. In my best Blue Peter moment, here's one I made earlier. I say that in the Netherlands and people just give you weird looks. If I have a look at my custom domains here, you can see that you get this wonderful nice pond OEB3CB603.5.AzureStaticApps.net. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to have to tell that to people. And I don't think it's quite going to catch in their heads. So if you're using this for something that you do want somebody else to access, you're going to need a custom domain on it. You can add that in the browser really easily here. But of course, we don't want to do that. We want to add it inside of our pipeline. Because if anything happens to our resource, we want to be able to get back up and running in just a couple of clicks. So first things first, let's name our workflow. And again, workflow dispatch. I see this one being ran even less than the infrastructure as code. Only if you're changing your domains that you need to register, will you need to change this. Then we're going to get our code. And we are going to do our Azure login again, and you're going to ignore the way that I'm logging in. And then we get the fun stuff. In order to set a custom domain, you need to get access to the URL that you are trying to link to. In the browser, that's easy, because if I say add custom domain, and no, I don't want to do an Azure custom domain, I want to do a DNS and blah.stacy.cloud. I'm going to need to put this value into my DNS record in a CNAME record in order to get my custom domain to work. So we need to get our custom domain out of our application before we can move further. And this is where our AZ Static Web App comes in again, because we can see every environment that we have available. This will list all of the staging environments and the production environment for our static web app in our resource group. And we can then query that with just the name default. That is our production static web app. So we can extract that host name and we can now have that available for use. Then we have a second one. This is going to be really fun. This did not work on my run through earlier, and it's down to my code. It's not down to the pipeline, so I don't mind showing it. And I don't know if Porkbun's changed something or what, but it wasn't working. But we can bypass this. I, as you can guess, use Porkbun to manage my domains. They're cheap, they're easy to use, and I don't get any commission, so I'm not trying to sell them. They also have an API that they can use to set their DNS records. I am sure other domain providers have it as well, but I'm not going to show you this code because unless you're using Porkbun, it's useless to you. But what I'm setting here is a CNAME record against a subdomain of my choosing, which would be, I've missed a step. I've missed my environment variables, which would be ent demo for enterprise demo because I'm too lazy to type. So that's going to set my CNAME record for me. And then after that, I can use the static web app function inside of the AZ command line again to call the host name and say that it should go here. Subdomain.stacy.cloud or whatever domain you want to use. Please don't use mine. Use your own. That's going to be much more useful to you. Something that you may notice here, we're only setting a subdomain. So this is what you're going to need for setting www. You also need to set a second record when you are setting custom domains, which is why even on the free tier, you get two custom domains that you can use. The second one is just your Apex domain. So Stacy Cloud is my Apex domain, and I need to set that one. You can do that one inside of your pipeline, and you probably should do that one inside of the pipeline. I'm not going to do it here just because of the sheer amount of time that it takes. But there's a couple of commands that we can use. The first one is we can use static web app hostname set, give it our Apex domain, and say that we want a DNS text token out of it. This can take anywhere from 5 minutes to 45 minutes to run. So that's why I don't include it in the demo, because I don't think you want to sit and wait that long for it to do something. Once you have your validation token, you can then do a second command, which is hostname show, and that will extract that validation token for you, and then you can pass that on to your DNS provider in order to update the record to what you need to do. So Apex domain, absolutely doable. Yes, you should do it, but for a quick demo, it doesn't work because it just takes too long. I'm sorry. So this is everything that we should need. So let me rename this. Haha, I remembered the second one. There's only one more to go. Am I going to remember the third one as well? And we're going to push this one up. And we're going to see whether or not our infrastructure... Ooh, our infrastructure failed. That's unusual. Why did you fail? incomplete read. That is an interesting one. I have never had that one before. Let me just give that one a quick check. Why are you not pretending that you're YAML in my screen? Interesting. This all worked this afternoon when I did my run through, because of course it did. Let's have a look. Workflow dispatch. We have the right things there. Azure login. Oh, that's custom domain. I want that one. Checkout, login. Create it. Okay. You're really not happy, are you? That should have worked. Well, of course it should have worked. Hey, shall we see what Copilot says? We have Copilot power now. Let's see what it says. Real life use of Copilot on the fly. Is it actually going to be useful, or is it going to just give us nothing stuff? Okay, so Azure possibly timed out. Let's rerun the job and see what happens and hope for the best. It's not like there's a big Azure conference going on anywhere in the world right now, is it? That's like not happening in Chicago or anything. Okay, well, we're going to let that go. We're going to keep our fingers crossed. But I have noticed that GitHub's not happy either, because this code space should be looking quite different to this, and it's not. So we're just going to restart that one as well and see what that does. Push comes to shove, I can show you the one I did. Hey, that's better. That is what I expected to see. Nice, pretty colors. And nothing underlined to say that it's bad. Yes, yes, yes. There's an Azure function and you're not doing anything with it. Okay. We're going to see what happens there. This is where it died last time, isn't it? Okay, so we need to wait just a second because I just want to see if it dies here again. So in the meantime, for the geeks among us, did you hear that on the enterprise, they're changing the engines to run on garden herbs? Apparently, they want to try time travel. Thank you. It doesn't get any better than that. Oh, that's looking much better. We actually have more of an output now. Okay. So, word for the wise, Azure can time out sometimes. So if I look in my resource groups now, you're going to have to trust me that this one is only just being created. But this is that app that we just created, Yellow Dune OFOF69C03.5. And we have, congratulations on your new site. Your site will be ready soon. Please check back later. And that's because they assume you're going to be using the portal, and this is already going to be running inside of your GitHub repo. We're not doing that. So now we've done that, let's set up the custom domain and watch that fail. It should fail first time because it can take time for the DNS records to propagate. But if it does what it did this afternoon, I'm going to have to cheat. But we'll give that a couple of seconds to work through. In the meantime, let's have a look at what we can do to actually get our application working. Because we've now created it, but we still need to deploy it. And we need to do all of that cool stuff that the out-of-the-box pipeline was going to give to us anyway. So we're going to add a new file here. And that one is going to be called, I can find my notes so that I can copy it without showing you how badly I type. Build and deploy app, because naming's hard. What we're going to do is have a pipeline which is going to test our app. It's going to publish the Blazor application. It's going to publish the Azure Function, and then it's going to upload them. But we do have an issue when doing this, because that default pipeline has other bits of magic inside of it as well. Not only does it recognize what language it needs to build, it also recognizes what type of Azure function it needs to prepare for you. When you are just pushing a deployment up to your static web app, it can't do that. So we need to give it some help. There's two ways that you can do this. One way is when you do a deploy, you can have something called the static web app config JSON. And this is another way that you can control your applications from within your code. So this is used for lots of different things. So I have it for navigation fallback here. That just means that if somebody goes to a page which doesn't exist on the server, it's just going to return the context of index, and then it's going to let the routing of the client application take care of the rest. Because if you're running a SPA, most of those pages don't actually exist. So you need something like this in place. Otherwise, you're going to get 404s when a user hits F5. Interesting one. When it first came out, I don't think that was available. And in order to fix that, I had to do some kind of Azure function that did the redirect for me. It was a freaky piece of coding, and I am so pleased that they fixed that really quickly when it went into preview. The other one that you can do in your static web app config is set up security on your routes. So here we can say that for the root API to-dos, for post, put, and delete, only authorized people are allowed to call this URL. So this will take care of all of my endpoint authentication and role checking as well. So this does a lot of stuff for you out of the box. You can also do overwrites in here. So you can do your custom 404 page, your custom error page. There's a lot of functionality here, which I'm not going to get into today. The last one that you can add in here that I'm going to add for now, we're going to return to this later. But for now, what we can do is tell it, this is the platform that you are going to be running on. So this is an API platform, .NET Isolated 8.0. When you do a deploy, it will now check the static web app config JSON, because this is in our www root folder. This gets published with our app and gets uploaded. And it will use this to make sure that the correct resource is created for our Azure function. We're not going to use this one today, though. We're going to do something a little bit different, because there is a second option. In order to do the deploy, we are going to be using the static web app CLI. And you can control that with a different JSON file, SWA CLI config.json. And the SWA CLI, I'm going to show you in a second, it lets you do a lot of tasks with your static web app, both locally and in Azure. And you can give it different configurations so that it can do different things at different times. The one that we're using here, we're going to give it a configuration called deploy. We could call this anything online. It's only called deploy, so it's easy for us to use. And that is going to tell the static web app CLI that our application can be found in the www root of the dist client folder. API can be found inside of the API folder. And we have a .NET Isolated 8.0 application. Using this, we can now upload what we need to upload and make sure that the correct resources get created when we do that. So I can't remember, did I install the Static Web Apps CLI? No, I did not. So let's install that one while we're waiting, because I do want to show you that. I'm not going to do a deploy from this container, but I do want to show you what it has available before we write our pipeline. So while that's installing, let's see how this failed. I'm either going to be happy how it failed or unhappy. And I'm unhappy. I keep on getting this error, and I've only got it this week. Every time I've given this, this has worked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat. On a different page, I just so happen to have my domain management open, and I'm going to set a record for this. So I want to CNAME and demo. It needs to go here. Add that record. And of course, I've timed out, so I've got to log back in again. I'm sorry. You can't see this because I don't want to dox myself too much, but it's annoying. Okay, I'm back in. Yay. So let's try that one again. We want a name and demo. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I am going to cheat, and I'm going to change my custom domain. And I'm just going to say, you know what? That's all created. You don't need to do anything there. It's not the most important part of what we're looking at today anyway. So let's stage that one and update custom domain. Okay, bet some for whether or not it works a second time or whether or not I'm going to swear. Does that go against the code of conduct, Kevin, if I swear if it fails?
You can swear at your computer.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't think I have feelings.
So now we've installed the SWA CLI. You can see I've used npm install on this, and that is because this started life as a Node.js server that pretended to be the Azure resource so you could debug your static web apps locally. So this would do the proxying to your front end and your back end and fake authentication endpoints and all that kind of stuff so that you can actually debug your static web apps locally. But once static web apps went GA, they actually added a lot of stuff to this. So this will now allow you to log directly into Azure. The start is the debug. That is where it starts up a local server for you, generally on port 4280, and allows you to use your application as you would inside of Azure, nearly. It's not 100% the same, and they tell you it's not 100% the same. So always take that with a pinch of salt and always test in Azure to make sure stuff works before you go live. We can do a deploy, which is what we're going to be using today. You can initialize a new static web project, and that will just create for you the base configuration files that you need. It will build using whatever build information you was given. So API build command, .NET publish C release. So you can have different configurations to build different things. So you have that build command. You can go to the documentation, which is useful sometimes. And you can also access the databases because Static Web Apps now supports, in preview, data API builder. And that I hope we're going to be looking at later. Did that work? Well, it's still running. It worked. Yeah. So if I refresh this now, we should have end demo Stacy Cloud. And if I go there, I've not deployed anything yet, so it doesn't find anything. But hey, it works. We have a custom domain, so now we can deploy something to it. And like I say, we're going to be using this static web app for that. So let's get into this. I'm just going to close all of these because otherwise it's going to cut me off. We want build and deploy. So as you can imagine, our build and deploy is going to start with a name and how we're going to push to it. So build and deploy application, make sure it's all readable for people. And here is where our CI/CD starts. So here we are. When we push to the main branch, except for when we're changing our infrastructure as code, because you don't need to redeploy when you're changing your infrastructure as code. Or when we have a pull request, which is opened, closed, reopened, or synchronized, exactly the same as the default pipeline, we want to do something. We still need a couple of environment variables. We need our resource group and our static web app name so that we can get into this. And then we can start our jobs. We should have 3 jobs, but at the moment there's a little bug in the CLI that we need to work around. So we're only going to have 2, but I'll show you that one in a second. Exactly the same as before. If we are pushing, or if it's a pull request that isn't closed, we're going to fire off our build and test pipeline. We're going to set up .NET 8, which you don't have to do, but I like being explicit in my pipelines. And here is a bit where you have the complete control. What do you want to do? Do you want to run your tests? Do you want to call Sonar Cloud? What other static analysis or code security checks or anything else? That is all that you can run here before you get too far into the pipeline to make sure you are pushing what you want to push and not just randomly pushing everything every time without checking. So there's nothing particularly scary there. This is just like the bit where you can go wild and have fun and make sure that your code works and is secure. Then, like I say, we're working against a bug at the moment, which I know the team is working on. But I still want to show you the code needed for what I want to do next. It's just going to be commented out. So that you can easily do a rollback, what I prefer to do is to push my published files and my swar config, because that's important, up to an artifact. And then I start a new job, which still runs exactly the same. As long as build and test is passed, it will run this job. And that will download those artifacts so that you can deploy your application. Like I say, I do this just because if anything breaks, it's nice to be able to go back to your previous deploy and just rerun that deploy workflow rather than having to build everything and do a rollback of code and everything else. This is the easiest way. When it works, this is the easiest way. Always a proviso in there. Once we have our code, we need to know, or our deployment files, I should say, we need to know where we're going to be deploying to. Are we going to be deploying to production, or do we need to make a staging environment? And we do that based on the event name from GitHub. If it is a push, then we know we're going to production, so we can set an environment variable to production. If it's not a push, we know we're in a pull request, and then we need a staging environment. So here, we're going to say our environment is staging, and then the number of our pull request. You can name this whatever makes sense for you. The only important thing is make sure you put that event number in there, because this allows you to find it later on. So this is kind of the important bit. Everything else is just fluff to make it look pretty when it's inside of the URL bar. Now we have our environment. We can log in again. And then we need to install that Static Web Apps CLI. So here we're going to set up Node, and we're going to run the install on that Static Web App. This does take a little bit of time, but in my experience, when everything's working as it should do, this flow is no longer than using that default workflow. It's still reasonably quick. Then we have our issue. Everything is now installed. We should be able to deploy, except we have no idea what that deployment token is for our static web app. Set it up in the portal. It creates that secret for you on your repository. Well, we set it up in a pipeline, so we don't have that. And more than that, we want to be able to recreate this at will. So we don't want to be storing that token inside of our pipeline. Thankfully, we can get access to it using the AZ Static Web App again. We can get access to our secrets, and we can get our API key out of those. And we're going to put that into a variable, and we are going to make sure that we use the right options and parameters on this call so that we don't dox our API key to our GitHub logs. This is kind of important. Next, we're going to add a mask to that secret so that, again, when we use it inside of our workflow, we don't dox ourselves. And then we just output that so we can use it in another step. Interesting, when I was writing this talk, I learned you cannot share a masked environment variable between jobs. If it's unmasked, you can share it between jobs. If it's masked, it is lost when that job finishes. So you have to do this step in each and every place where you need this secret. We only need it in one place, thankfully. It's just good to know because it's going to save you a lot of head scratching. Now we're going to deploy our application. And there we have two different things that we can use. So number one, the one that we are going to be using, we can have swa deploy. So we're calling the deploy command. We are using the deploy configuration. We are giving it our deployment token that we just got, and we're telling it to deploy to the environment that we worked out earlier. If you are not using the static web app .config.json, let me get this right. If you're not using the static web app CLI to do the deploy, then you have to do it slightly differently, because obviously you won't have the deploy stuff in there. Then you have to give it all of this information externally. Come on, stop jumping around. I'm trying to show people stuff. So all of that then has to be done on the command line because it's not in the config file. And if my experiments are correct, because it's not in the documentation, you cannot set your API version both in your static web app config file and in a configuration that you are using to deploy using the static web app CLI. It is one or the other. If they're the same, it might work for you. If they are different, it just doesn't know what to do and it just completely does nothing. So pick one. I would suggest you go this way because it makes your pipelines a lot cleaner and it gives a lot more information to the developers when they're looking at the static web app config CLI inside of their machines. So if we deploy this now and we run it, that is going to create, or that is going to upload to our environment for us. However, we want to go further than this because we want to update our pull requests so that we can do our staging environments. So we're going to add a task or a step which is only going to run for pull requests. So if you're deploying to production, job's done, we stop here. If we're deploying to an environment, staging environment, then we are going to go back to that environment list that we used in our custom domain pipeline. And we want a host name which contains the environment, because that environment will always be in the host name. So this is how we can extract this out. And again, put it in an environment variable to use. And then we can actually update our pull request. And this I'm using the GitHub script. Again, if we have a pull request, then we are going to make some markdown that we're going to put into a comment. And we're going to use the REST API to add that comment to our pull request. And then last but not least, we need one more job because we need to do some cleanup. So when we are in a pull request and we're closing it, we are going to log into Azure again, because strangely enough, you cannot deploy a static web app using AZ Static Web App, and you cannot clean up an environment using the SWA CLI. And I have complained to the team about this. I hope they fix it at some point. It'd be nice to pick which of the two CLIs we want to use and not have to use both of them in the pipeline. And here we just say environment delete. We don't need to guess what our name is because we have our naming convention. So this will just remove that environment for us. And if I remember, I did it. I did it. Every single file I turned into a YAML file before I pushed it. It's very rare I do that in a talk. We are going to say add, build, and deploy. Whether or not it works, I've probably done something else wrong instead. We'll find out. So that one gets pushed up. And if all has gone well, we now have our build and deploy action. So that's now going to go to our production environment. What we also want to do, though, is create a branch. And inside of this branch, what we're going to do is go to our index page and say, here are your to-dos. .NET Chef. Say hello to .NET Chef. I'm on change screen, commit and sync, publish. Create a pull request. Create. And hopefully, we now have one pending check. So this is now going to build that application and deploy it. And again, if we go to our actions now, we can see we've got 2 actions fired off. Now, the fun one is, how long is this going to take to deploy? Sometimes it's really quick. Sometimes it's not. What we're going to do in the meantime is have a look at authentication, because it's something I've not really covered a lot yet, and I've not put anything in the pipeline about, and there's a very good reason for that. Let me change this back to main, because otherwise I always forget, and then things go wrong when I try and push my next stuff. With an Azure Static Web App, you get an implementation of Easy Auth out of the box for free without having to pay for it. It integrates with, I guess I have to say, Entra ID, not AAD anymore. And it integrates with GitHub. It used to integrate with Twitter, Facebook, and Google, but they never went GA, unfortunately. Hopefully they'll come back. I've heard talk, but I don't know anything. What you can, I can only add a site once it's been deployed. Here, you can invite users that need explicit permissions. So for most of your users who don't need any major permissions or anything, you don't need to look at this. They can just log in by default. For users that need that explicit permission, you can add up to 50 users and you can manually invite them in this screen, clicking the invite button, like we're going to do, hopefully, in a minute or so. Oh, look, it finished. And what you can do here, you can say, okay, on GitHub, I want Stacy Cash because it's me. I want authorized. And it will give me a link which is valid for an hour. And if I now come into here and I log in, why are you still not finding it? That's interesting. Okay, you loaded. I'm going to say that I did something weird on my domain, which then for some reason is not working as it should do. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to look at this now. I'm going to look at this tomorrow, and I will put something on Blue Sky and LinkedIn about what I find. What we're going to do instead is carry on working instead on the yellow June. So I need to change my invitation because I want it on the default domain. So let's generate that. I need to consent to the Azure app to get information from my account. And I am now logged in. And this isn't going to work, and I'm not sure why. Oh, it did work. Awesome. I can now store information in my database because I am a super user. I'm authorized. If I log out and do this, it's only transient. But if I log in, there we go. I get my to-dos back and I can do stuff with them again, and it's all awesome. Obviously, you don't want to be doing this for all of your users. That would not be fun. I would argue that if you are using a pipeline to deploy your application, you don't want to be doing this anyway. And the reason for that is if I come to here and say /auth/me, this is my user ID for this static web app. If I go to stacyclouds.net/auth/login/GitHub, this is my user ID on my own website. You can see it's a different user ID. Every time you log into a different static web app, you will get a different user ID, which means that if I now delete this and rerun my IAC pipeline, it is going to generate all new users when I invite them again, and you're going to be left with a whole load of orphaned records and very unhappy users. So if you're going down this road, do not use the default authentication that's built into it. What we're going to do instead is we are going to use Auth0. You don't have to use Auth0. We're just going to be using OpenID Connect. So anything that supports that, you can use here. You can use Entra ID. You can use Facebook, Twitter. I think there's even an integration for Apple or a custom authentication, which is what we're going to use for Auth0. Did the other one finish yet, by the way? Just a completely tangent onto something else. Here are your to-dos, .NET Chef. So we now have our staging environment available. And what we're going to do is say, okay, you know what? We will merge that while we're working on the rest of it. Then we get 2 more pipelines kicked off. One to do the cleanup on change screen, and the other one to redeploy our site to production. So our pipeline is now doing everything the default one did, only we now have complete control over what it's doing. So this was kind of the bit that I wanted to get to, but we need to go just a little bit further. So let's close all my paths again. First thing we need to do with custom authentication to get that working is go back into our static web app config file. Told you we'd be back. And one of the options that you can add here is auth. When you add auth, you can add one or more connectors. So you don't only have to pick one, you can log in using lots of different ones. I'm using, like I say, the custom OpenID Connect, but you can use the built-in ones and connect directly to existing functionality. You need to give it a name, and this will be the login path. So you saw when I logged into my site, I did auth login GitHub. If I was using this, it would change to auth login OpenID. We need to have a secret and an ID to connect to our authentication application. And this isn't the value itself. This is the setting inside of your static web app that you're going to be using for that. So you're not going to be doxing yourself in your GitHub repo. Everything's going to be nice and safe and secure. And the top one here, we have a roles source. This is a special Azure function, which is not accessible to the outside world. You can only access, only the static web app itself can access this Azure function from inside of the static web app. And that will take the client principal that I showed on the screen here, which when you do an open auth connect, you get a lot more information back. And using that information, you can create the roles that you want for your user. So that's what this function needs to be. We're going to create that in a second. So this needs to go to our client application because that's where the configuration is deployed. I also want to change the location of my login button because it just makes it easier to demo. So I want to go to my menu here, and I don't want to log in using GitHub. I want to log in using Auth0. And then we need to do the custom roles itself. There's not a lot in this to actually, I mean, this will now work. You won't be able to use roles for people, but if you deploy this now, you can use that custom authentication. It is that easy. But we do want roles, so we are going to add a new file here, and that's going to be get roles.cs. This is one of the most painful pieces of code I have had to write in the last 4 years because it is impossible to debug right now. And again, I know they're working on fixing this, but be warned right now, writing this get roles is a nightmare because you can never call it locally and check that it's doing what the static web app expects. The only way you can debug this is by setting up application insights, going to live metrics, logging into your application, logging out of your application, checking the live metrics, checking the error messages, check a load of logging messages that you put in, console log only towards application insights. It is a nightmare, but when you get it working, it's awesome. And I'm going to have a cheat for you. If I don't tell you the cheat before the end of the talk, please let me know because I will go back to the cheat. But all that we have here is just a very fake get roles function. It's a post. In the body of the post, you have, like I say, this client principal object. We can check to make sure that we have information there. If we don't, then we're going to throw errors. And then you have to do some processing with that to provide new roles. So everybody that logs in using Auth0 is going to get a user details role, apparently, an identity provider roles, apparently, and their authorized role that lets them log in. Please don't ever do this in production, but you get the idea. And then we return that just as a list of roles as JSON, and the static web app itself does magic with that and makes it available to your other APIs and to your front end. So in theory, this should be everything we need. So let's push this one up as well. Add custom auth. Check that's going. That's coming here, and here are your to-dos, .NET Chef. So our pull request has worked, and we actually have new code on our screen. Woohoo. Obviously, we also need to actually create our auth application here. So we're going to make a new one, regular web app. I always forget to change the name of this. And we need to set some settings. Now, I have all of these nicely set to go, and none of them are going to work because they all rely on our custom domain working. So I'm going to have to change them. Apparently, I did not smile at the demo gods well enough today. So we need this, and we need to say, where are users allowed to log in from? And they're allowed to log in, obviously, from our wonderfully memorable URL. That's not a problem at all. We need to say what callbacks are allowed. And we need to say where they can log out. These are all set for you by the static web app. So it has a callback, it has a logout, and obviously we have that login auth 0. So you know what these are going to be just by a callback URL goes to callback, logout goes to logout, login goes to login / name of your custom authentication. So we're going to save these changes. And then we need to take some data out and put it into our static web app. You can do this all in the pipeline, but I'm not going to do it for time because I appreciate I've been talking for like an hour and 10 minutes now, and I do want to show you some other stuff as well. But let me show you what you would need to change if you were going to go through the workflow and wait for it to finish. It comes down to our infrastructure as code. There would be 2 changes that we would need. Number 1, we would need to set the SKU to standard because you can only use custom authentication inside of the standard tier. And number 2, where we set all of these wonderful settings, you would need to add 2 extra settings for that auth 0, auth 0 ID and auth 0 secret that we had inside of this file. If you set those inside of that file, rerun it, it will update your static web app and you don't have to do anything in the portal. We're not doing that because I'm cheating, but okay. So let's go here and do this the cheating way in the portal. So we need the standard app. As you can see, it is super expensive to do this. It costs you a whole €8 a month in order to be able to use custom authentication. It's not as good as free, but I've seen more expensive Azure Resources. And you get other stuff as well. You get the 5 domains, you get bigger app sizes, more staging environments, and you can do more things with the Azure functions. You don't only have the built-in managed ones, but you can also bring in external functions. You can add app service functions, Azure Container Apps, API Manager. You have a whole extra layer of what you can bring into this. And in an enterprise environment, I would expect you're going to use that because you're going to want that better control over the back end. So let's save that, make sure that it updates the hosting plan. Then we can go to our environment variables. There are the 4 that we had previously. Custom domain works. So now we should be able to add our extra variables. So we have our auth ID. And we're going to put my demo auth 0 app in there. Let's apply that one. And then we need the second one. And here I'm going to dox myself, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to delete the key this evening as well. We need our secret. So we can copy that. It's great. You don't see it when you copy it, but you certainly see it when you paste it. So we now have our auth ID, auth secret, hit apply. Settings have updated. Let's log out. Let's keep our fingers crossed and touch wood. It's thinking. This is a good sign. You didn't see it because I've already logged in on this browser, but hopefully you can see here from this auth provider, we have actually gone out to auth 0. And the first time I've logged in, I have data because I use this frequently for my demos. So now I can get my data that I had before. And this is how you need to do authentication if you are going to be running it in this type of environment. This is the safe way to do it. I believe that's everything that I wanted to say about authentication. I think it is. I mean, it's one. I think the important thing to remember here is by using the custom authentication and by using our roots here, we've actually put a lot of protection onto our API. Now, when we go into the API, that's the one last thing I wanted to show you. I knew there was something else that I wanted to show you because Kevin gave me just a little bit of extra time today. When we are posting our to-dos, sorry, brain fog. For those that don't know, I'm struggling with chronic fatigue and long COVID. And at the end of the day, my brain really starts to turn off. So I apologize for that. Okay, I'm not using it here, unfortunately. But if you wish to use that same client principle inside of your Azure function, it is passed in as an XMS client principal header. This sounds incredibly dangerous, but it's not. If you try and push this from the outside world, it will be stripped out when it goes into the static web app. So when you're in your API, you can be sure that if you have that header in your request, it has come from the static web app and it isn't somebody trying to inject it from the outside world. That one, I think it's an important one to understand how that works so that you know how it's done. And that leads me on to nicely. I said I wanted to show you the way to cheat, and I apologize. This is 100% blatant self-promotion. I have a couple of packages available on Nugget to work with static web app authentication. And the reason why I made these is because it took a lot of the legwork away from me every time I wanted to do the same thing. So the client will work with Blazor and give you authentication inside of Blazor. And the API, as you can imagine, gives you access inside of the API. So I can show you how these things are actually supposed to work. So let's go to that organization. So for the API, there's two things that I have in here. One of them is to get access to that client principal, which is passed in by the SWA itself. And the other one, that get roles, I have actually made the get roles for you. And all you have to do is just inject a role processor, and it will do all of the checking around it. call the role processor, which just takes in a role client principal and sends out a list of roles, and then I return that to you. So this just takes away all of that hassle that I was talking about creating it. This deals with that one for you. And then to get the information out, inside of your request, you have your collection of headers. And whether you use my system or not, that really doesn't matter. But what you have to do is get that XMS client principal out of the header, convert it from the base 64 string, and then serialize it as a principal, and then return that back. And anytime you get an empty principal, you know that person's not logged in. And we do the same on the client side. So the client side, if you use this, it will add the authorization core, and it will add an authentication state provider. If you know Blazor, you know what these things are. This is how you get authentication inside of your application. And it just uses this state provider to do that. So we literally make a call to that auth.me, because that is how we get access to the client principal in the front end. We still have the bearer token on the static web app. We make a call to call.me, and we get information back about the user that's logged in. Turn that from a client principal into the claims principal that .NET uses, and then you can just use it everywhere in your application, the same as you would any other authentication. So yeah, sorry about that. A slight little shameless plug here, but this saves me from about 20 minutes of typing every time I spin up a new Blazor application. So I eat my own dog food here. I eat it. And if you use it and you have an issue, please, Blue Sky LinkedIn, let me know, and I'll take a look or raise an issue on it. That was kind of like mainly what I wanted to show you about the pipeline, because I think from all of this, hopefully you can see that this isn't a flashing the pan toy just to deploy hobby sites or whatever else. You can use this to deploy serious applications, and you can get a lot of control over how that is done. I hosted a conference a few weeks back, Static Web App Day. And to close the day off, we had Jeff Ritz talking about his experience with ClipTop, because that ran on a static web app. It was a spectacular talk. I don't know if you have the ability to email people or give messages to people, Kevin, but I will send you the URL of the raw conference. I still have to split it up into individual talks, but I would recommend watching Jeff's talk, which is around the 7-hour mark. And he basically talked about, he started his Clip Talk on his Twitch stream, and it grew bigger and bigger and went through multiple re-architectures as he ran the limits of different Azure resources. He ran the limits of external database resources, then moved back inside of MS, and the SQL team, I think it was the SQL team, were using his Clip Talk as a benchmark of what it can do and to see where it struggled, because he had so much data in there. And the only thing that never changed throughout any of this was the static web app that he used for the interface, because that just scaled automatically without a problem all the way up. So yeah, you really can use these things as workhorses. They are ready to be used in production. Do you guys mind if I take another few minutes? Because although this isn't part of this talk, it's something that I think is cool and I would love to show you. I have a demo set up. I think it's this one. We are using an Azure function in order to get access to data in that demo that I just showed you. However, if you are just reading data, or if you have data that authorized users can write, you don't actually need to use that Azure Function as long as you don't need to do processing on it. There is a thing called Data API Builder. It's generally in Azure anyway, but it's actually pre-release built into Azure Static Web Apps. So you're still only dealing with that one Azure resource. And it all works directly out of the box. So what you need to do to get this working is... Let me just get my different notes out. The fun one here, the notes that I'm using right now are chapter 7 from my book that I'm updating for the latest version of how to get started with Azure Static Web Apps and Blazor. That DB function that I showed you earlier, you can use that to initialize a couple of JSON files. You don't have to do this. You can manually write them if that's your thing. There are various database types that you can run against. I'm using Cosmos DB just because it's free if you don't do much with it. You can tell it what database you need to use and what container you want to use, although I probably wouldn't use that one too often because it can cause issues in the long run. If you're only using one container, it's fine. When you run this command, you get these two files made for you. The first one is your connection to your database. So you get an environment variable for your database connection string, the database you want to connect to, and like I say, I'd leave your container null because you can override that later in this file, and that's much more useful. When you do this, you can either access your data using a REST API or a Graph API. You notice REST is false here. That's because Cosmos DB team won't support this. They say Cosmos DB already has a REST API. You do not need to overwrite that for us. So they only give access to the Graph API, unfortunately. But if you're using SQL or MongoDB, then you get a REST API enabled for it as well. But we get a Graph API. We have a mode that we can set locally. Although this database config file is used in deploying your static web app, this mode is ignored. It is always production in production. So you can safely leave this on development unless you want to test a production-like environment. It can say where the authentication is coming from. So this also integrates directly into that static web app custom auth that we've just built. And then we can say the 8 entities that we have. And I just have a string container here. And you can see we have our permissions. So we can say that anonymous people can read, but you can also copy this one. And then this one, what would it be? Right, maybe? Create. So, hello. Thank you. So when you're using this, you still have all of that same level of authentication and authorization that you would have for your Azure function. There's a proviso here, and this is because it's in pre-release and it's not complete yet. I said, if you can have data that anybody in your group can read or anybody in your group can write, I could use this for reading blog posts for, say, for a website or something like that. I couldn't use this in my to-do application because we only want to return to-dos for the person that is logged in. And there is a way of doing that. On these actions, you can put extra clarifications in there. So you can say only when this field equals this part of your authentication. So you can check that somebody has the right ID to either create or write a record. But I can't do that for the to-do, unfortunately. When it goes general availability, that will be fixed. I believe the full-blown version already in Azure in general availability that does work. They've just not ported it to the static web apps yet. And what this gives you, when you have your string items, I love this bit, by the way. When you create a new entity, it automatically gives you the plural for it so that you can use it inside of your file. So if I just do something here, because somebody did something clever here. Add string item, blah, 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 blah. I'm using deb here, but you can do this via the static web app as well. If you run this, this is on my, this isn't anything, so I can add this. Let's change this to Goose. This, I just think this is cool. We have a goose and we have geese. So it automatically knows what the plural is for you. It doesn't just put an S on the end. And it gets even better. Shred a sheep, plural of sheep is sheep. I wasn't expecting this to work when I was researching it. It's I enjoyed this bit. Let's have a look. So let's get rid of those because we don't need those for the demo to work. What you have when you finish building this, am I missing? Yeah. If I use that SWA CLI now and I run this, and by saying dot, all I'm saying is treat the current directory as published files. And if I give it the correct command, and I tell it where that data API location is, you can do this inside of the SWA CLI configuration file. What it's going to do now is spin up that data builder API. And then, obviously, nothing's found because I don't have any files in that directory. But if I go to data API, I get information about whether or not my data API is healthy or not. If I go to Graph, when I'm running locally, I get a debug environment for my GraphQL queries. So I can say, get my query strings, and I get a link to my actual live Cosmos DB of the things that I have in there. And I think that this is going to be a really useful tool in the future as well when you're trying to use this for more than a hobby site. This is going to give you a lot of power to be able to create queries on the front end, give your users more power, and give you as a front-end developer more power without having to continually redeploy your APIs. Okay, I think I've taken enough of your time. So we've done a lot of hammering on the keyboard. And if it works. At this point, I always have to thank these three people, because when I started writing this talk a couple of years ago, I did not know how to use GitHub Actions that well. And Max, an old colleague of mine, he gave me a huge hand and actually wrote the initial pipeline for me, or with me, not for me, so that I could change it and make my talk from it. And Rick van der Bosch, he is a CSA for Microsoft. Between him and Oscar, who is a speaker from the Netherlands, they also do a lot of stuff with static web apps, and we have brainstormed together often enough and like had to think about, okay, what would be really useful here, what would be really useful there, and made all of our talks better from those conversations. So I just want to say thank you to them for the effort they put in to help me. So that was 1.5 hours. I hope that it was interesting and useful. Hopefully that you've, like I was saying, hopefully you've seen that you can really use these things properly now. I'm not expecting you to be able to go away and write those pipelines tomorrow, but hopefully you have some idea of where you need to get started if you want to do that. On screen right now, there's a QR code that links to a set of resources on my site, both from Microsoft and from myself. And again, shameless plug time. I have a book, Beginning Azure Static Web Apps. And in the second edition, this is going to be included in there. Don't buy the book right now because I'm literally rewriting it as we speak. So write it when it's re-released next year. That'll contain a lot more information and work a lot better with the current versions of .NET. Well, with that, yeah, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for the attention and the time that you've given me this evening. This has been an awful lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it.